Hi class! In preparation for our virtual parliamentary debate, I have invited one of the debaters that I look up to since first year law school. He has this fine style in debating. So help me welcome Garrett Paolo Nolasco. Hi Kuya Garrett!
Hi, Zerah. Good evening to you and to your students. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to share what I know about debate with your students. So, thank you very much for having me tonight.
And thank you so much for saying yes to this collaboration. What made you say yes, Kuya Garrett?
I like participating in debates and even watching or listening to them because of the added knowledge that I can gain from each particular topic that is discussed. So, it's enriching for me and as well as for the other side, but more on having different points of view and analyzing things from different perspectives. So it's very enriching for a student of any age.
Wow, that's really wonderful. I agree that debating opens the mind. So, without further ado, let's tackle the basics already. So, what are the basics that the students need to know about debating?
Yes, I'd like to start with the structure of the parliamentary debate. We have first, of course, there's adjudicators in front of the body, and then on each side we have the government, which represents the affirmative side, and then we have the opposition, which represents the negative side of the argument. And then there is a motion that is to be resolved by both parties, and you're given the choice whether to be in the government or opposition. But particularly in some instances, or in most instances, you switch sides between the government and the opposition. Let's look at the persons involved per team. So on the government side, which starts the conversation, which starts the presentation of arguments, we have the prime minister who usually speaks for 7 minutes. On the opposite side is the leader of the opposition who also speaks for 7 minutes. And then after he or she speaks, it will now be the turn of the member of the parliament, the second member of the government side, to talk about their arguments and also rebut whatever the leader of opposition raised as arguments of the other side. Then again, it's like a ping pong match. The fourth speaker will come from the opposition again, who's called the member of the opposition, who now has the task of rebutting the arguments made by the two speakers from the government side, and then adding more arguments to support the opposition's main points.
Mhm.
And then there is the third speaker, which closes the arguments, who presents the rebuttal for the opposition side, who he or she does it for 5 minutes, beginning with the opposition rebuttal. And then the debate is ended with a last speech coming from the third speaker of the government side, who sums
Mm.
up the arguments of the government side again for the similar amount of time, which is 5 minutes. Let's start with the government prime minister. What is actually your role? So, assuming you're chosen as the speaker, the first speaker for the government side, your important role here is to contextualize the debate, meaning to say to frame it. If I may give an example, the one that Zerah and I and my teammates worked on back in 2006. Gaya na kayo, no? 2006.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a sort of a background. Attorney Zerah and I, together with our four other teammates, worked on a fictional case involving a general who's being tried for war crimes because the case presented that elements of his military group worked in coordination with some armed units which are not exactly under his command, but in a way they were taking orders from him. So the question of that problem is whether the general can be held responsible for the actions of these armed elements who are not particularly members of his armed forces but were taking orders from him. So the question there was command responsibility. Can the general be held responsible for war crimes, for the acts of these armed rebels, even if they are not specifically under his command? as the government side, and I think Zerah will still recall this, our argument there is to present that even if these people were not under his direct command, they were actually under his effective control. Meaning to say, when he exercised effective control, they follow their orders, and to a certain extent, he's responsible for their actions. So that was the context that we provided for the government side. So at the start of the debate, or the moot court, that's the moot court experience, we already put the tone in effect.
Mhm.
So as first speaker, it is very crucial for you to set the tone from the get-go. Now we are arguing on the affirmative side, and these are our parameters. Also, the prime minister has to make definitions of terms very, very clearly at the start of the speech, because this will now be the guide on which the arguments will be made. Third, the outline of the team's presentation. It's the responsibility of the prime minister, or the first speaker, to state early on what are the arguments that the government side will present and who will be presenting them. It sort of gives the judges and the audience a map to follow where your arguments are leading. Last, but I think most important role of the prime minister of the government side is to really establish the main arguments of the government side. So the two or three of your strongest arguments should already be well in place by the time that the prime minister completes his speech of 7 minutes. Okay, moving on, let's go to the next side, which is the leader of the opposition. The role of the leader of the opposition is now to reframe the topic of the debate. So, if, for example, in the one that I gave earlier, the framing of, or the contextualization of the problem is that the general exercises command responsibility or superior responsibility over the rebels because he actually gave them orders and they followed orders. The other side, the opposition side, should now try to reframe that and
Mhm.
say that according to law, there is no command responsibility because you cannot establish a superior subordinate relationship between the general and the rebel forces. It could only be a matter of cooperation instead of taking orders from a general. So in that way, the opposition
Mhm.
recontextualizes the topic of the debate and frames it in such a way that there is no command responsibility. There is no link between the general and the armed rebels. So that is, it's an example of recontextualizing the debate. And then the leader of the opposition, similar to the prime minister, will also have to outline the main arguments now of the opposition side. In so doing, he or she will pinpoint strongest arguments as well in her speech, and then leaves to the second speaker of the opposition to provide supporting statements for their case. Now, the most important task of the leader of the opposition, apart from giving their main arguments, is actually to immediately rebut the argument of the prime minister. So, as I will also explain later on, it's important to have a clash, like a
Mhm.
head-to-head, what do you call this, refutation of arguments. You can, if the first speaker says there is command responsibility, then your argument here should be there is no command responsibility, therefore he cannot be held liable for war crimes. And then use arguments there to establish that there really isn't any command responsibility present. Then you work on that, you build on that. The second speaker will also provide examples and cases, situations where it is supported that the general did not have command responsibility or did not exercise effective control over the armed rebels.
Okay, so what if there is another definition for effective control on the part of the prime minister and then another definition which is for the leader of the opposition?
The best thing to do here is to get which one is the prevailing or the ruling definition and use it as an argument that, let's say, the government side has an outdated definition of command
Mm,
responsibility. But in the case presented, just say 2010, assuming there's a case to that, the definition has now been broadened. Then
mhm.
this new definition is controlling. That alone already defeats the argument of the government if you're able to establish that.
That's a good point, Kuya.
Mhm. Okay.
Okay, next.
Yeah, moving on. The next one, the second speaker of the government side. What's the role of this person? If you are assigned to give this 7 minute constructive speech, your very first role is to rebut the arguments of the leader of the opposition. Right there and then, the first speaker no longer has the opportunity to debunk the argument of the first speaker of the opposition, since his or her time has already expired. This it will now be upon the second speaker of the government to start rebutting the arguments, the counter arguments made by the speaker of the opposition side, and then provide two or three more arguments to bolster the main points of the government side.
Mhm.
So, take for example, in the first speaker, he says there is command responsibility because he gave orders and they were followed. Then the opposition side says there is no command responsibility because there's just cooperation. Now, the second speaker of the government can rebut that and say it is not just cooperation because
Mhm.
in the case given, several orders were made and they were followed to the letter. And if they did not obey the general, there were consequences. So these can be the supporting arguments that the second speaker can provide to further strengthen the argument that no, it wasn't just cooperation. This was actually a case of command given by the general, and then the armed rebels following or obeying the general, so to speak. Again, by debunking or by refuting the arguments of the first opposition speaker, the second speaker of the government also has to provide examples or more arguments supporting the initial claim of the government, provide more instances, more legal backing, and more cases to support what they're claiming as the motion, how the motion should be decided. And then going to his or her opponent on the opposite side. Again, as we mentioned, this is like a ping pong match.
Mhm.
The member of the opposition, the second speaker, will now rebut the arguments made by both the first and second speaker. Primarily the points made by the second speaker, but if there are points of the first speaker that they have to destroy or to weaken, so to speak, since these are the main arguments
Yes.
of the government side, he can do that and he can add more arguments for the opposition in his speech. So he's given 7 minutes to do that, rebut the
Mhm.
arguments of the first two speakers, and then strengthen the case again of the opposition side. So these two speakers, these second two speakers, they add meat to the arguments already presented by the first two speakers. Now, it is important that you do not repeat the arguments made by the first speakers, but instead add on to them. Remember that this is only 7 minutes. The first two speakers have to introduce their side. They have to introduce the members, and then the arguments, and then they only have little space na lang for their main arguments to be decided, not including the fact if points of information are raised. So it's possible that not all the our arguments are presented during the 7 minutes. So it's the role of the second speakers to actually close that, meaning they have to wrap up the main arguments and provide additional arguments to make the case that the motion should be decided for their side. So this is also a critical part of the debate, the role of the second speaker. So they have to be ready also with their meaty arguments. The reason why I'm saying this, and I'll also move to the fifth speaker now,
Mhm.
is the rebuttals. The third speaker of each side will now be in charge of rebutting arguments, but they are not allowed to present any new arguments. So this
Mm.
emphasizes the role of the first two speakers. The role of the rebuttal speaker is only to counter the arguments made by the second speaker and then defend their position, summarize the main points of their side, and
Mhm.
then provide a strong conclusion. But introducing a new argument during the rebuttal is a sign of weakness, that oh,
Oh.
you were not able to with the two speakers that you have, with the 14 minutes that was given to you, you were not able to present your case strongly and
Mm.
convincingly. So for the rebuttal of both sides, I'm speaking for both sides now, no, opposition and government, theirs is actually summations. They have to summarize the points, they have to highlight the points where there were conflict, and
Mhm.
then as they highlight the points where they clashed, they have to emphasize why their side is the correct version, why their
Mm.
side wins the clash. So highlighting the clashes, but bending it towards your argument. Therefore, the rebuttal speaker has to have a powerful conclusion also. Bale, if I may just go back, no, the first
Mhm.
speaker to make the rebuttal will be from the opposite side, as we discussed earlier, and then the
Mhm.
next one, the last speaker, will be from the government side. So the government side, this is their last pitch to present to the adjudicators and to the audience. Na this is the case we made. The opponents tried to defeat our arguments by saying one, two, three, and four. However, we still win the debate because the merits of our arguments are far better than theirs. Then he closes it with, this should be decided in our favor because the law support our arguments, and then the impact of the case leans towards our side, which is
Mhm.
if we decide in favor of of the government, the impact to the society or to the persons concerned will be better than what the opposing side is presenting.